Okay. Without further ado.
Cool. Yeah, I think today we'll go into moving from Rhino to Blender. So I have this very architectural model that I put up on Google Drive if you guys want to follow along. But it's just like a very simple massing form. There's four layers. There's like a concrete material. There's a wood, marble. We'll see if we can get to doing water, maybe. If not, we'll just make it glass or something. But yeah, if you have, I know most of us use Rhino to model, but to kind of export to Blender, um, because Blender uses kind of meshes instead of NURBS, you have to do some kind of, there's a way to export from Rhino to Blender, so we'll kind of get into that. So whenever you export from Rhino, you always want to kind of select what you're exporting. So what I've done is I've organized everything into kind of layers, but we'll see when we go into Blender, you sometimes have to do a bit of manual tweaking. So what we'll do now is just select everything and we'll go to File, Export Selected. And then what we want to do is export as an OBJ, which is like a wavefront format that Blender can read as well.
Do you know what OBJ stands for?
Like object. It's like a wavefront format, something that
I've always just told people it means object, but I don't know if that's true.
I think it's wavefront. I don't know what that means though.
I don't know either.
Um,
OBJ. Object replacement character. Ooh. Okay. Oh, maybe not. Never mind.
yeah. So we'll when you're exporting to OBJ, you'll get these options. What you want to do is you want to export as polygon mesh, so that Blender can kind of read those surfaces. And then when you go into naming, you want to export the Rhino objects names as their object, and then make sure that layers are as OBJ groups. That way, can Blender knows kind of what layers they're on, and then these can stay selected, merge nested group layer names, and then sort as the groups. The rest kind of goes into more detailed nuances like the amount of surfaces. For example, if you click OK, it'll come as uh, the quality presets and the mesh parameters. So if you want more polygons or less, fewer is generally better because then you have less faces and less kind of editing to do after. Most of the time when you want to export from Rhino, I would suggest trying to keep your surfaces and your modeling as kind of basic as possible. And then when you're doing tweaks to do them in Blender, if you are going to like do that workflow of rendering in Blender. So we'll keep kind of a fewer polygon count and then just click OK. Um, and then we should have that OBJ file exported. So we can do something open Blender. And then we'll go into File, Import, and then you'll see the different options you can import as. FBX is also one when you download files from online, from like Sketchfab or any of those websites. Usually, Blender can read FBX or Wavefront. You also notice it has STL, so if you're doing 3D printing, you can also import STL files into Blender since it's a mesh, and then kind of edit those meshes how you please, and then re-export. So what we'll do is we'll click OBJ because that's how we save the file. You want to locate that file, .obj, and just import, and it'll just kind of come into Blender. So we'll notice when you go into the viewport shading that the material properties that I had applied in Rhino kind of exist in Blender as well. So if you go to material and if I click on this kind of wood, you have this oak light, and then if I kind of pull this tab up and then go into shader editor, you'll notice kind of the node structure of that shader. So if you wanted to kind of texture map in Rhino, you could, and then export it to Blender and then use those textures. So for example, if this texture is it's at an angle, if you wanted to remap it, you would kind of come to the mapping node in the shader editor, and then you could play with the rotation. So this is on the Z axis. We can rotate that, and then you'll notice that it'll just kind of shift, and that way you can kind of maintain the same textures from Rhino. But what I find is that usually the mapping is quite small. You have to play with the scales, and you can usually get better textures from either built-in like Blender kit or downloading them from online. So what we can do is we can try to texture in two ways. One is from downloading specific texture maps from online. So what one website that's quite nice is Polyhaven. They also have a plugin for Blender, but it's a paid plugin, so you can also just download straight from the website. What we'll do is browse some textures. So if you look at the file, we have this kind of wood, this concrete. So let's try to adjust the concrete texture. I think the first thing we'll do is I'll go back to viewport shading, and then if I go into edit mode, you'll notice that the sometimes the surfaces map in weird ways when it exports to Blender, and this won't be a problem when you're doing texture mapping, but if you're trying to UV unwrap or do some kind of editing to the surfaces, it's kind of weirdly manipulated. So an easy way to kind of fix that is if you go into modifiers and to add a decimate modifier. And what this does, it kind of like removes as much of the unneeded mesh surfaces. And you could keep it as collapse, and then let's say the ratio is around 50%, so it'll kind of remove 50% of the surfaces. And then if you're out of edit mode, you can just apply that, and once you go into edit mode, it'll kind of reduce the amount of surfaces. So if I control Z, if you go into planar, which is what we'll use because we have more flat surfaces and they're not kind of rounded. And if we apply that, what you'll notice is now we have kind of larger surfaces to play with. And that'll be easier to kind of edit and tweak later on if we wanted to do some editing. So we'll go back into kind of shading and try to download some textures. Let's see. So if I want to download a concrete texture, plaster concrete, we can find one that kind of looks interesting. Let's see. We'll do this one. And then you'll notice they have different options. So you can download textures for different formats. You have different resolutions. Usually 2K is a good bet because you're never going to be like really up close to textures. And what these textures also do is give you different maps. So you have like a normal map, kind of a bump map, which kind of gives you displacement, and then various types of textures and shading. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and download, and it'll download as a zip file. So we'll save that. And then what you want to do is you want to extract the zip file, and then we'll go in and then we can see the different files that come with it. So within the textures, you have kind of a diffusion layer, a displacement, a normal, and then a rough. And all of these combined will kind of give you that realistic texture within Blender. So now what we'll do is we'll go back into Blender, and within the materials, we'll kind of remove that dark concrete and kind of start from fresh. And what you want to do is make sure that Node Wrangler is enabled. And I'll explain what that does within the shaders. So when you come into the preferences and you scroll down, you'll see Node Wrangler. It's kind of built in with Blender. Just make sure that's enabled as an add-on. And then what we'll do is we'll click new kind of material. And when you go come into this VSDF, which allows you to input all those different materials. So I think it's T. Let's see. Yeah. Oh, there's a shortcut for this. Okay, this is where Google comes in. I was using it the other day. How to put, there's a shortcut. It's the Control Shift key. It is Control Shift key.
You know it all. Stop saying.
Okay, you need to make sure that the node is clicked, and then if you hit Control Shift key, it should come up. Yeah. So then what you'll do is you kind of go into that extract folder, so concrete layers. You'll go into the textures, and then you'll see you have the four layers to kind of input. So we'll select all of those, and then select principal texture setup. And then what you'll notice is that what Node Wrangler has done is kind of arrange those nodes accurately to kind of place each map in the correct spot. So you have mapping, which kind of allows you to change the scale, the rotation, and the location of the texture. And then this kind of group allows you to have the color, roughness, displacement, and the normal map. And that's all evenly kind of placed within that material mapping, so that you don't have to kind of change all the settings yourself. So what you'll notice is that the mapping is kind of small. So we can come over to scale. And if you click on X and then drag down, you'll be able to select all. And then you can kind of shift up or down. So what we'll do is we'll kind of bring this down closer to, let's see, point 1.5 looks good. Right, that's good for now. And then if you want to play with location or scale, you can mess with that as well. Let's see, maybe. That's good. And that allows you to kind of texture different materials. The other way is what we discussed last time is kind of selecting a material or an object and just going into the Blender Kit plugin. So if you click N, if you have Blender Kit kind of downloaded, you can go into the materials there and then apply a material to that object. So the categories will go into wood, and then let's say we select kind of this first one that comes up. And then what you'll notice is it only applied that to kind of one of the materials. So there's a way to kind of link different materials together. So what we can do is we can organize. What you'll notice is that everything's just been inputted as an object. And since this is a simple scene, it's kind of easy to place everything in a collection. So what we'll do is we'll make a new collection. We can call this one wood. Actually, another one, call this one concrete. And you can select those materials. Let's see if those will. And click this one in there. Okay. just deselected. I'll just hide these. Yeah. And then just you can select these and then drag them into the wood. And it just helps keep it organized. Um, so now what we can do is if we wanted to link kind of the texture from this material to the rest, what you want to do is you want to select all the materials and then shift select the material you want to link or the object you want to link the material from. And what you'll notice is there's a different kind of highlight color. So the light orange color means that that's the one that's like selected first almost, or anything you do will be based off of that material, and everything else is dark orange. So what we can use, we can hit Control L, which kind of allows you to link and transfer data from different objects, and then we can link materials. And then you'll notice all those materials have been linked to that to the rest of the materials. So if we go into kind of the material shader tab, you'll see kind of we have that natural wood material. And if you go down, you'll see the number of users of this data. So you have 40 objects that are using that same material property. So if you were to come to that material and kind of go into the mapping, you can change the scale of that material and it'll kind of adjust for each one. And then you can kind of change, let's see if I do that and the rotation. That, and now we have some kind of materials mapped um, onto this wood. Now what we can do is we can unhide the rest of the scene. So that's kind of the basics of either importing your own textures and applying it, or kind of using the built-in system to just apply materials and then apply it to a lot of different objects. And it's always nice to organize your space, and having materials in a specific folder. So if I have this concrete, I can move that into this folder. And then again, if I want to link this same material, I'll click this material and then click the one I want to have linked, and Control L, and then link material, and it'll kind of map that material there as well. So what we can do is we can add another material to kind of these tiles or the seating. Let's see. We'll go into Blender Kit, and let's say we want to do a marble type material. That one looks good. And then we'll do the same thing. We'll select the rest of the materials, and then that one last, and then Control L and link materials. So that's kind of mapping the textures. And now if we wanted to kind of render, so this pipeline is good for modeling in Rhino if that's more comfortable. Bring it into Blender, mapping your textures, and then kind of producing some renders. So what we'll do is we can add a camera again. And then I always like to kind of align the camera so that it's also save. File save, everyone, file save. Where am I saving this? Yeah, we have me and Josh, who's also my roommate, we sit beside each other. Every 5 minutes, one of us is saying file save, just to make sure that we're not losing our stuff. Yeah, so now, yeah, we have the camera, and what I usually like to do is I like to have a separate collection for kind of the model, and then a separate collection for lighting and cameras. That way, it's easier to kind of just turn them on and off and adjust what's needed. So I'll make this one camera and lights.
The collection's just like a group, right?
Yeah.
It's the same thing.
And then what we can do is, again, we can pull out that tab and kind of view the camera. And now we can kind of adjust the location of that camera. So if I select the camera, I can hit G, kind of move, and if I hold on the Z axis, move it up and hold Control, we'll kind of snap it. That, and if I wanted to kind of accurately place it in like a plan view, you can use that kind of gizmo at the top, hit G again, and then move it along the Y. That, and then let's say I move it along G or the X axis. And then if I want to rotate it so I have an angle and it's not very orthogonal, I can hit R, and then if I'm rotating it on the Z axis, I'll hit Z, and then I can kind of rotate and kind of get this view here. So what you'll notice again, what I did last time was I increased the passing part so that you don't see the rest. Because what happens is this gets kind of distracting when you're trying to view the camera. So we'll go back into the camera properties and then viewport display, and then this kind of pass part out, I'll just increase to like that. So now we can see accurately kind of what's in that scene. Um, and now what we can do is we can go into um, kind of the rendered mode. And you'll notice it's not lit up because we haven't put any HDRIs or lighting. So now we can hit Shift A to kind of place your cursor to where you want an object being placed, and then introduce the sun. Now we can do is we can just move that up so we can see it, and then we can kind of play with exposure, kind of the strength of that sun, and then kind of the angle. Um, There is kind of add-ons to do like real-world lighting in Blender where you can introduce locations. So if you wanted to model this in Vancouver, um, I think there is, forget the add-on, like it's let's see. Yeah, so there's certain add-ons. This extensions.blender is real nice. You can just get add-ons, drag and drop add-ons into Blender, and then just enable it. So this add-on kind of visualizes like the sun path. Um, there's ones that can accurately locate the sun. So if you were to click, let's say Vancouver, it'll locate that. But for this, we can just kind of play around and getting a nice visualization. Um, for me, I don't usually use the sun because it's harder to control accurately. I like to input my own kind of light sources and then adjust that to kind of emulate the sun. So what I'll do is I'll hide that and I'll introduce a, let's see, an area light, and I'll just move that up. And what I've done is I created this model just to have like those gaps so we can see how lighting is visualized in Blender. Um, we'll increase the scale of this light by hitting S, and then you can kind of hit Control again and scale at a certain level. And if you wanted to rotate, hit R, and then along the Y axis, we'll lock it, and you can kind of place it here. And let's say we wanted the light to hit the back wall as well. We can hit R again and then rotate along the Z, and it'll kind of shift and hit the back wall. Um, and now we can increase the exposure of that light and the power. Let's see. And you can see it kind of works there. And then we'll notice again that we're in EV mode. So this is like very quick lighting. If you wanted to see more accurate ray traced lighting to get kind of more photorealistic, we'll go back into cycles. And then make sure your device is set to GPU so that your laptop doesn't explode. And now we have this kind of scene laid out. Um, I don't really like this wood texture, but yeah, we can always adjust those. And then here you're able to kind of just play around with the lighting um, this data tab. This I'm always here on the tab in the right, just adjusting settings. You kind of give your spread. So the spread is kind of the angle of the light. So if I bring the spread down to say 2 degrees, um, it'll it'll kind of visualize that exact angle of the square. I don't know if there's if it visualizes. Let's see. I know the spot does it. So what I'll do is just to show what how that kind of system works. I'll introduce a spot. I'll hide this one. Eight.
And the spotlight is kind of like a pot light.
Yeah,
It's like a cone.
yeah, it's a cone shaped. Do that. Yeah. So if I increase the exposure on this one, that. So what you'll notice is when I go to kind of the angle, I can click show cone. And now this will just visualize how that kind of light is working. The angle kind of increases the spread of that cone. That it's wider or more narrow. So narrow would be more like directional lighting, and you can really choose where to kind of shine light. If you wanted to kind of light a specific thing, a specific area, or have like a vignette, this is a nice way to do that. And then again, the blend mode kind of allows you to kind of blend out the edges of that lighting to make it less harsh. So like this to let's say 100. Now we have kind of a more moody uh, render. Yeah, so that's kind of how to play with lighting. You have the radius of that light source. Kind of the larger you go, the more soft um, the fallout is. The smaller the radius, the more kind of directional it is. So if I go back to kind of that area light, um, the beam shape or the spread being 2% is like very linear. Whereas if I kind of increase it, let's say to 50, it kind of spreads out that angle of the beam. So I'll keep it 20 just to give like a nice directional light. Actually, I'll like go down to 10. Um, and then I'll decrease kind of the exposure. It's maybe getting a bit too bright. And then if you want to highlight this area, again, rendering is more or less trying to make your like spaces look the best as possible. And lighting is like the number one way to kind of play with that. So if you want to introduce a light on this side, hit shift and then right click. That way we're introducing the light behind the camera. And then we can have another light. And let's say we want a spotlight, hit G, and then bring it up, and then kind of angle it towards, then rotate on the Z axis towards here, and then we'll increase the exposure. That's now, it's not completely dark, and you have kind of some light on that space. So then what we can do is we can introduce kind of other elements like models or elements that kind of give you scale of that space. So we'll hit shift, right click onto this kind of bench, and we can go back into Blender Kit by hitting N, and now we can go into models. And this is just a quick way if you have your own models, if you want to have um, like scale figures, like people in shadow, you can introduce them in Photoshop as well. Doing it in Blender allows you to kind of see the shadows of objects. So we'll go into free first because I don't want to pay for anything. And let's see if we can find some sort of like character. We might have to bring Suzanne back.
Okay.
Let's see. Oh, cool. There's a rigged baby Triceratops. Okay, we'll introduce that.
It's cute.
Nice. That's in the scene. If you want to rotate it, oh, it's rigged. R. Oh man, it has a rig.
Oh.
Yeah, I won't rotate it. But now it's introducing the scene, and it kind of brings a sort of scale to the scene. So whenever you're doing renders, it's always nice to have scale figures. That way, when reviewers are kind of looking at your drawings or like renderings, they're like, I don't know how big the space is, or that kind of allows you to do that. So that's kind of the basics of like setting up a scene. Whenever you're rendering, you don't necessarily need to have everything modeled outside of the space. It depends on what you're showing. So if you're doing kind of an interior, even an exterior shot, it's best to kind of model the extent of what you're visualizing, because it takes way too much time and effort to model the entire thing just to render out one render. And it's not a great use of time. So I like to kind of map out or either write down a storyboard like what I'm gonna render. So if I want an interior render, for example, and then like exterior elevation, um, I'll have drawings for those, and then I'll model out those specifically. Because if you see here, we have nothing else outside of the space. It's just this model, and you can place the camera strategically just to kind of highlight that specific area. So what we'll do is I'll show you how to export kind of an image as a render. So what we'll do is if you go to the right, you want to make sure that anything that's turned off in the viewport is also turned off in the renders by clicking the camera, which we have here. And then what you want to do is you want to go into output and make sure that output file is not the temp file, it's in whichever folder you want to save. And we went over this last time, but there's a lot of different settings in the output and in renders. What we'll do is we'll decrease the samples to around 120 just so that it doesn't take forever. And then in denoise, what happens is so what samples are is essentially the amount of pixels that it's going to kind of like calculate. The more samples you have, the denser the pixels are that it needs to calculate, the more time it takes. So what downsampling means is using less samples, but you'll get a more noisy image. And then you can use the denoise tab to kind of use or like denoise that image after it's rendered, and that kind of speeds up the process. And it's nice to use optics because that's the GPU based denoiser. And there's a whole myriad of settings that we can kind of adjust. Light bounces essentially means the amount of times light hits a surface. So ray tracing essentially uses how light hits a surface, bounces off that onto another, and then another. So the more bounces you have, the more complex the render is going to be. I like to keep this around 3. If you have glass and you really want like accurate renders, you can increase it to around 4 or 5. Anything past that won't really kind of increase the quality of renders. Um, Caustics are essentially like dealing with light in glass surfaces. So you have like reflection and refraction. What you want to do is click on this fast GI approximation. So what it'll do is it'll just kind of speed up that process. Um, what I've done is like I spent a while just figuring out what each setting does and doing test renders and seeing how long they take to kind of render out a scene. There's also compositing, which I'll go into after we do this render. We'll do GPU and then let's see. in final render. Persistent data essentially means if you're doing kind of a motion scene where the camera's moving and you're rendering out a video, it it doesn't start to re-render or like um, reintroduce data. When you start the render, it'll calculate the data and then it'll maintain that data as it does the render so that it kind of speeds up the process. Um, so that's good for now. We'll go into um, output in within the output you have pixel density. 72 is usually good if you're doing kind of visual media, but if you're aiming for print quality, 150 to 300 is good for prints. The renders might take longer, but since we in architecture we pin up larger renders, it's kind of advised to bring this up to around 150. But for this, we'll keep it at 72. It essentially means the density of pixels within an inch. When you print, the denser the pixels are, the more clean and less noisy the image looks. So with all these settings done, we can kind of go into render and then render image. And then it'll kind of pop up with this tab and um, do a quick render of that image. This is at 1080p. I usually render at 4K, and what it does, it'll tile the renders. So that took 11 seconds, which never happens. They usually take like 10 minutes. So now that we have this render, we can image and save as, and just find the folder and test render. And then you have different media types. So you can save as a PNG, JPEG. There's different formats. Um, Usually when you do an image, a PNG or JPEG is great. We'll go into how to render kind of motion media and like a film. Um, Color depth, 16-bit color depth has the larger file size, but it gives you more kind of um, data for working with if you wanted to bring into Photoshop. Um, RGB is generally good, and 8 color depth is also generally good for renders. And then we'll save that image. So that image is saved. If you notice, let's say you do a render that took around 10 minutes to do, and you want the light to kind of have a different atmosphere, you want to change specific colors, there's something called compositing in Blender. So if you come up to this compositing tab, you can click that, and then what we'll do is we'll hit new, and what it'll do is it'll bring up that render that we just did, and if you click V, it'll kind of zoom out, and Alt V will zoom in, and now this allows you to kind of visualize that space within the compositor tab. So one thing I love to do when I do compositing is to add bloom, which gives this nice like shiny look to the light, so it's not so harsh. We can do that by hitting Shift A and then adding a bloom, which is essentially like a glare effect, and we'll put it within the render layer. So you'll notice that this render layer is going into the group output of the image and then the viewer. So the viewer is kind of this image in the back, and then the group output is the image that we just rendered. And these changes that you make here will be applied to all your renders without having to re-render the image. So if you notice that the color of a specific object wasn't great, you can adjust that color within this space just using nodes, and then you don't have to re-render everything. So for the bloom, what we'll do is we'll come down to the strength and kind of bring that down to, let's say, 0.1, maybe smaller. And it kind of just gives a shine. The light here isn't that great, but um, let's see. And that just gives you that nice glare. Um, Compositing is quite complicated. Like I still don't understand all of it. But there's kind of different options you can have. You can adjust different colors. Um, you can have different effects such as filters. You can put noise. You can mask certain objects. You can add textures. Um, But since we're all usually good with Photoshop as well, because that's like a common software we use here, it's also nice to kind of export from Blender and then go into Photoshop, um, and kind of do post processing that way. So what we'll do is we'll go back to layout, and if we wanted to introduce kind of motion media into this kind of render, if let's say as part of your final kind of review, you wanted to visualize the space through some kind of renders of the camera tracking the space, we can animate the camera like we did last time using keyframes. So what we'll do is we'll go into timeline, and we'll increase the frames to 30. And then what we can do here is, let's say we start the camera at over here, we can go into the objects, the location, and hit a keyframe, and then move, let's say, 3 seconds. We can move the location X by a couple meters, hit the keyframe, and then when you play it, the camera kind of shifts and visualizes the space. If it's too fast, you can just spread that keyframe further out. And then what we'll do is we'll go into render into sampling and viewport. If you hit denoise, it'll kind of help get rid of that noisiness. But what I like to do is when I'm working in space and visualizing the camera, I'll stick in EV mode. That way the camera's smoother, I can see the motion. So we're doing a nice reveal of that Triceratops on the bench.
There's it. Yeah.
Cool. And then you can layer multiple kind of camera motions and scenes in Premiere Pro, which I'll go into right after this. I won't export this whole thing because it takes forever. But so to export a video, how Blender does it is it exports each frame individually, and then you would compile those frames within a software like Premiere Pro. So what we'll do is we'll go into output, and you just want to make sure that you have kind of a folder made. So if I were to make a folder, let's say final export, click that folder and accept. And then what we can do is we want to make sure that what we're rendering is just the amount that we need. So frame 0 to 150. We'll change the N here to 150, and I will just be exporting those kind of frames. So if we go to render, we'll go back to, let's see, cycles, so we can get the accurate lighting, and we'll go into render, animation. And it'll just start rendering each frame within that animation, starting from frame 1, and it'll output those frames within that folder. So now it's going into frame 2, and it'll just continue doing that until it gets to all the frames. So I'll close that because that'll take forever. Usually when you do kind of visual renders or motion media, PNGs are generally too big, and you'll have like 50 megabyte images, and let's say you have 150 images, you'll have like 20 gigs worth of images just for a couple seconds. So usually a good format is TIFF. I don't understand what this stands for, but from all the other ones, it kind of has the least amount of like storage space. There's another method of using kind of OpenEXR. This kind of allows for the most amount of data. You can export kind of depth passes, mist passes, so that you can import those into After Effects and then play with different layers. So if you wanted to select or 3D map that space in After Effects to put in kind of different elements within that space, that mapping will allow you to do that. That gets into advanced like compositing level of motion media, which I probably wouldn't be able to teach. But we'll stick to TIFF, and then you can keep the color depth at 8. We don't really need super high color depth. And then for this, we can keep it at 72 because it is visualized on a screen. So what I'll do is I'll go into a scene that I have rendered out a couple days ago, just to show you kind of the amount that it renders. Let's see. So I have this final kind of render file, and it's rendered out 390 frames, all in TIFF. Um, and to kind of bring that into a file, we can open Premiere Pro. Let's see.
I think you can also do this in After Effects if you don't
Yeah.
have Premiere Pro.
We haven't gone over Premiere Pro, right?
No, I
Yet?
don't think so.
Okay. Maybe I'll give a quick Premiere Pro.
Premiere Pro is
Yes.
an additional Adobe
Yeah.
product. Have any of you used Premiere Pro? So it's kind of like iMovie, but a little bit more capabilities. It's mostly used for editing and stitching clips together, from what I understand. I've only ever really used it for that function. So if you are just stitching footage together, it's a little bit more pared back than After Effects. Might run a little bit faster on your machine. And it also has some tools, like I think there are some like rotoscoping and coloring tools inside of Premiere. So it's less for animation and more for stitching
Yeah.
together. But it is a separate Adobe software. It has a really similar interface to After Effects. So if you know After Effects, you probably have a general understanding of how to work in Premiere Pro. But
Yeah. The pipeline is usually like, if I were like render it would be Blender into kind of After Effects to do different effects, and I would render those scenes out, bring it into Premiere Pro, and then stitch everything together. Because After Effects has a lot of layers that you adjust with, and then kind of stitching in there it gets too complicated.
the timelines can get
Yeah.
so sometimes it's good to export to here.
Some of this. So if you wanted to go import media, you can click import. Right, I usually do right click import, and let's say we have this kind of exported scene that we've created. What we'll do is we'll click on the first image within that file, and you want to go down, and there's this tab that says image sequence. And what it'll do is it'll kind of do the processing of gathering all those images together and bringing it in as one video. So now we have this kind of sequence that's been created, and if we want to drop it in a timeline, we can just click and drag into the timeline, and now we have kind of an animation that plays with a heavy file. Let's see if it loads. Oh man, okay. But yeah, you would introduce it into Premiere Pro, where you can kind of stitch it together. Let's see. Okay. Um, should I go over Premiere Pro from Blender, or just stick into go back to Blender?
Maybe we'll focus on Blender
Yeah.
for now. Premiere Pro is kind of like a nice to
Yeah.
have. If you have any time to chat more about manipulating textures, Blender to adjust how they sit on objects. I've had problems specifically moving from Rhino to Blender. Sometimes the mesh comes in kind of crazy. And if you have any advice for like how to do it
Yeah.
with textures.
Yeah, so we did go over kind of like having usually in a file if you have textures that let's see, go back edit the faces. That decimate modifier is good in kind of reducing the amount of mesh faces. And over here, this one kind of imported as you have this weird like triangular face. A nice way to kind of bridge those faces is in edit mode, hitting 2 or going to edge select, selecting that edge, and then right clicking and then dissolving that edge. So what dissolving does, it kind of merges the two faces together instead of just deleting the edge. So if I were to hit Control Z and let's say I um, delete the edge, what it'll do is it'll also, since that face was using the edge to kind of connect with the other face, that face also gets deleted and it kind of leaves you with some weird artifacting. Um, so within Blender, dissolving is generally better for maintaining kind of the surfaces of the face. What I've realized is in Blender, there's a lot of manual kind of tweaking and editing. It is time consuming, but it goes a long way in kind of cleaning up your meshes and just editing, just so that when you're mapping textures or doing any kind of modifications later down the line, it simplifies it a lot. Um, so if I come into kind of this space, I can try to dissolve this edge. Let's see, that one's not really working. Yeah, so if we go back into shader editor, import shading, oh, here. And you want it to like kind of rotate the concrete texture because you wanted to go either north to south instead of east west. Again, we can go into shader editor, um, and mapping is like a big part of um, kind of adjusting and tweaking to your likeness. So um, the rotation, this is along the like the x-axis. So if you rotate this, it wouldn't really work. So since we're on kind of the Z axis, we can rotate that by 90 degrees, and it'll kind of map it out. But you'll notice that it also kind of adjusted the rotation of this material since they're linked. So if I went to this one, it'll kind of adjust that as well. So to adjust those materials separately, what you want to do is you want to unlink that material by going into this material tab. And when you see this too, it'll say the number of users using this data. So what you're essentially doing is adjusting that material on like a world level. So any object that uses that material will be adjusted. So to change that, you can just click on this too, and what it'll do is it'll separate that material and create a secondary one. So now this one has material 2. We can kind of adjust that back to 0. And now this one has been kind of shifted 90 degrees, whereas this one's still at 0. Um, so it's a lot of little tweaking of separating material, like compiling materials together so everything has the same material, and then mapping textures individually if needed. Um, so for example, for this one, we can kind of shift that um, the axes for this one or these angles are shifting the same as this angle. So what we'll do is we can, let's see if I'll just do a couple. If I hit shift click these and then separate these, let's see. Oh, that'll just separate a bunch. But for example, if I were to take one of these, separate it from the layer, I have this new natural wood 3. I can, let's say that was 30 degrees, 30 degrees. So I remember which kind of texture to map it on. Um, I can go into the rotation, adjust the kind of rotation to align it. And then if I wanted to link that material again to the rest of these materials, I would shift click those materials, make sure this one's highlighted at the end, Control L, and then link materials. And now it's kind of mapped those textures along that axis as well. And that kind of little tweaking will allow you to kind of play with and get those accurate textures before rendering. Um, what else can I talk about?
Does anybody have any questions so far?
Yeah.
Any like horrible things to avoid other
Um,
than to save often?
horrible things.
If not, we could also look at animating the motion of objects as well. Like
Yeah,
we could drop the Triceratops off the tower.
yeah, we could try doing that. I think horrible things in Blender. I'm trying to think because there has been stuff that I've done, but don't do it.
Yeah.
One thing is creating like a lot of materials because then you just have. Um, I feel like naming stuff is like very important in Blender, so you know what's happening. I've had files where I just kept on making materials, and it would just be material one, two, three, four, five, and then I wouldn't be able to remember which material is what, and it would kind of make it difficult to add textures and materials, and then even when you're doing lighting, um, have when you introduce an object, it's always nice to name it before you start um, kind of playing with it. Um, for example, we have like in these wood columns, we have like wood object 10 to 49. Um, for this, it might be fine just because they're all the same and they're within one collection. But if you have like a variety of different objects at different scales and sizes, labeling them kind of makes it easier to model and render later on. Um, but the main thing for rendering, I would say, when you're trying to export nice renders, is mapping textures as best as you can, tweaking those little things, and then playing with light. Light goes a long way in kind of making your renders either looking flat or like dynamic. You usually want a nice daytime render. One thing I've learned from doing renders and visualizations is a nice like daytime render. If you can pull that off, it kind of solidifies your project or like your studio project. Because anyone can do like a nice moody render, make it dark, add one like harsh light, and it looks cool. But being able to like make a nice daytime render that kind of has like a nice, happy, energetic vibe, that's hard to pull off. And if you can pull that off, like you don't really need any other renders for your space. Um, So for those, usually it's about having like evenly lit lighting. So you can play with the blend mode and make it very flat lighting, and then introducing secondary and tertiary lights that kind of highlight certain objects. So for example, in this space, right now we have this light that kind of has the back kind of lit, which almost looks like the sun coming in. And then without this light, it's kind of hard to see the rest of the space. So what this does, it kind of allows you to have less harsh shadows. So if we wanted to highlight kind of the rest of this space, we could increase the radius of this light or the angle, and then also rotate along the Z. Let's see, rotate along X, and now we're kind of more evenly lit, and it kind of provides a more like visual identity in the space. Yeah, those are kind of my talking points on rendering. Yeah. Also, when you render, make sure everything else is closed. Don't do anything else while you render because your laptop will crash. Um, if you have a heavy file, another thing to do is you can hit out of rendered mode and go into shading and then click render. Because what Blender does, it'll try to like render that space in within Blender and try to export it, which it doesn't do that well. But stuff like if you have Rhino open, um, close the Rhino file. Any additional tabs you don't need, close it and then let it render. Um, yeah, if you're doing motion media, so if you're trying to render out, for example, 390 frames, each of these frames took around like 2 to 3 minutes. Um, and we all need work to do during the day. So what I did was I rendered it overnight. Just had my laptop plugged in, and just hit rendered, went to bed, woke up, and it was done. Um, hopefully it doesn't crash, but usually that's one way to kind of get these renders out and continue to do work during the day. Uh, yeah, that's what I have so far. Uh, I haven't really played with like gravity and collision.
Mhm.
Uh, if I wanted to make the Triceratops drop, could probably add. Oh, this is rigged. Let's move the rigs.
Yeah, there's some basic
Physics.
physics
Yeah.
properties in Blender that can add so collision is for like if you want two objects to hit each other and then react using basic physics. You can play with like the weight and mass of each of them, which is cool. There's soft body modifiers, which kind of like turn your object into like an inflatable or deflatable kind of cloth surface, which is cool. There's all kinds of other stuff, but you can play with like the physics of your object in an interesting way to have it interact with an environment.
Yeah, and then you can go into kind of the physics tab, and there's like a whole. Um, but yeah, again, any of these points that you adjust are based on like the metric system. So kind of if you have, for example, what's a nice one? Like where's the gravity? I haven't played around with this too much.
I actually don't know. I think that stuff can get a little bit complicated.
Yeah, you need to like understand math.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, Google's been really nice with just like how to make object fall in Blender, and it'll give you like a nice step by step. Yeah. The other thing I'll say, when you're rendering objects, if you have kind of flat surfaces that are very like harsh edges, it's always nice to bevel the edges, because what light does in Blender is if it's like it's a 90-degree edge, light reacts in a weird way to kind of harsh corners. So even in real life, you never have like a harsh 90-degree edge on something. There's always like a slight bevel. That way the light is able to kind of fall off. So one of the main kind of commands that I'll use is bevel on an edge. So if I click on an edge in edit mode, I can hit Control B, and it'll kind of bevel. Okay, that one's a bit rough, but if I, let's say I go into Shift A, mesh, X, view select. Right? If I hit Tab and I go into edit mode, I can hit Control B, and what it'll do is it'll bevel that edge, and to kind of make it rounded, what you can do is you can use the scroll wheel to kind of increase the segments. The more segments you have, the more like the rounder the shape will be. Um, Generally, like 5 is good. Then you can always add like a subdivision modifier to make it smooth. And this allows you to kind of bevel the edge. Um, and you can put in 0.01, and that small bevel will kind of just change that lighting um, in like a more natural way. Um, Beveling is also cool if you wanted to make stairs. You hit, let's say, hold that edge, Control B, and you have those options, and then within, oh, and then give me the option here. You have these kind of effects you can do. You can bevel the vertices, the edges. Um, you have different kind of options. You can have a profile type. So if you hit custom, you can kind of adjust um, the type of profile. So if you wanted to make kind of a specific trim style, you can adjust the profile within the bevel command, um, and then have a specific kind of edge. So within Blender, it's easier to use um, modifiers and kind of these commands to do your modeling rather than just doing it by hand. Whereas in Rhino, it's usually trying to get a surface, extrude that surface, and then kind of model there. You can also do whole edit. So if I was in object mode, I can go into the modifiers tab and then add a bevel modifier. And what that'll do is it'll modify every edge within that kind of object. So in object mode, any modifiers are attached to the entire object, whereas in edit mode, you would edit a specific edge that you would select. So you know, I can increase the segments to like 4. Let's say amount at 0.5. Too much because it's not a big two. And then you have this nice round kind of cool. And then we can also add in, and then we can shade smooth, and it'll kind of give you a nice clean look. Yeah. Any other questions, thoughts, concerns, opinions?
Okay, so Hamza and I are gonna do some file swaps. So we'll make sure this week's tutorials are up on YouTube. If you find yourself deep in Blender this weekend. I should have comments on everyone's little sketches on their desks by now. So, but if you do have any further questions about your assignment, please shoot me an email. I'll do my very best to be better at being responsive. Other than that, I think maybe we'll let out a little bit early if nobody has any questions. But we will.